Well, after serving more than 20 years as a member of Congress and running for president 3 times, yesterday Congressman Ron Paul gave his farewell address on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. It was classic Ron Paul, with messages of the need for a smaller government, far less spending, and also the need for a much stronger fight for liberty. It was more than 48 minutes long. Let's just play a small part of it.
Why do our political leaders believe it's unnecessary to thoroughly audit our own gold? Why can't Americans decide which type of light bulbs they can buy? Why is it the TSA permitted to abuse the rights of any American traveling by air? Why should there be mandatory sentences, even up to life, for crimes without victims, as our drug laws require? Why have we allowed the federal government to regulate commodes in our homes? Why is it political suicide for anyone to criticize AIPAC?
Well, a whole lot of questions coming from Ron Paul, and I want to talk more about the man and his legacy with Brian Doherty, senior editor at Reason. Truly, Brian, the end of an era here.
Oh, my God, yeah. I think all Americans should miss Ron Paul, whether or not they agree with the entire message he presents, because you have to admit there's no politician on the scene that we can imagine who's going to be that steadfast and that wide-ranging in defending Americans' rights to live their own lives, make their own choices, keep their own money. And not only that, he did a very interesting thing for the right-wing conservatives in his audience. He laid out this vision of virtue and morality that is not about policing people's behavior, but about recognizing that government force should not be used to manage other people's lives. And I think that's a vision of virtuous and moral people that I think we should all be able to embrace, right-wing or left-wing.
Absolutely. In not so harsh of terms, basically called out the hypocrisy of those who call for more freedom and liberty. But as he said, they only want it for themselves, not for everyone else. He said that is a problem. Talk to me about sort of the legacy that he will leave behind. I know, Brian, that the Republican Party this year agreed to include an audit of the Federal Reserve as part of their party platform. What else, though, is realistic in terms of, the Paul doctrine, if you will, actually getting adopted anytime soon?
I think where you want to look for Paul's legacy is not in any actual policy changes in the next 2 or 4 years, but to the 2.1 million people who voted for him in the Republican primaries and caucuses. Once you go Ron Paul, it's, difficult to go back. And I think that's a big part of the reason why Romney lost, is that he was not able to capture the affection and the votes of these Ron Paul people. And they will be out there looking for a politician to pick up that mantle. I mean, the most likely one right now, of course, is the dynastic heir, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who I think is great. And but these 2.1 million people and many millions more who have picked up his message on the internet and maybe didn't vote at all are going to be pressuring politicians in the future. The Federal Reserve, like you said, is definitely an example of an idea that was considered completely crazy 5 years ago. Ron Paul was the only person who believed in it, and it's now become pretty much the policy of the Republican Party. So that's an example that things can change very fast, and you should not write Ron Paul off as ineffectual.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who really follow him, and he says the same messages over and over. That is one thing that those dynamic followers, the disciples, as I call them, of Ron Paul say, and they're right. One thing that no one disagrees with, this is a politician who is consistent in his message, does not change depending on who's voting for him or what kind of race he's running in. Very consistent. Brian, let me play another part of that speech that really sort of hit home.
It was my opinion that the course of the U.S. embarked on in the latter part of the 20th century would bring us a major financial crisis and engulf us in a foreign policy that would overextend us and undermine our national security. To achieve these goals, I thought the government would have had to shrink in size and scope, reduce spending, change the monetary system, and reject the unsustainable costs of policing the world and expanding the American empire. Just following the constraints placed on the federal government by the Constitution would have been a good place to start.
One of the things that still so few people, at least in the establishment Republican Party, have adopted, even though, the Tea Party, which swept quite a few new members into office in 2010, have called for less government. But Ron Paul says less government spending, and that includes, very importantly, less military spending. Why is this still something that nobody even seems to consider, especially here in Washington?
You're right. That's exactly what the Tea Party missed about their limited government message, is it has to apply overseas. Democrats tend to be for whatever government program, right? And Republicans tend to be for them as long as they have this patriotic air. So it's very difficult to get either of the major parties to get serious about foreign affairs. And you also have to blame the voter, by the way. Exit polls show that foreign affairs were fifth on people's list of what they're actually concerned about. It's very easy in a world without a draft, when we aren't actually being attacked by our enemies, at least not for the last 11 years, for Americans to just forget about the cost and the expense and the danger of our imperial foreign policy. Ron Paul was the only one out there talking it up, but I will say that there is a new wave of Republicans led by Rand Paul who are recognizing, at least on fiscal grounds, that whether you want empire or not, we need to recognize we can't afford it. Ron Paul was great because he actually explained why it's wrong for us to be bombing the rest of the world to attempt to manage their affairs. But if we can get Republicans on board just on the fiscal aspect of it, then that will be great. Whatever it takes to pull back our extremely dangerous, expensive, and life-destroying foreign policy.
Well, and I think, you mentioned the statistic about foreign policy being fifth in terms of what people care about. But I think one of the things that Ron Paul was able to make that strong argument is the fact how related it all is to domestic policy, how the foreign policy of using drones in other countries relates to the security of the United States, how the spending on, a million different types of equipment that isn't even used by the U.S. military relates to the domestic policy and the lack of available spending here within the United States. So that was one thing. But I should say, if you watched the 48-minute speech yesterday, which very surprisingly, a lot of people are tweeting about, a lot of people did seem to watch. I do want to point out, it wasn't all doom and gloom. So I do want to finish up, Brian, by playing sort of an optimistic part of Ron Paul's remarks.
The good news is that compared to 1976, when I first came to Congress, the desire for more freedom and less government in 2012 is much greater and growing, especially in grassroots America. Tens of thousands of teenagers and college-age students are, with great enthusiasm, welcoming the message of liberty.
So that's my last question for you, Brian. I mean, what happens? I know you said that Ron Paul's heir, Rand Paul, could take a leadership role in terms of, a place for these young people to steer their energy. But this really was something I've never seen before, and I covered a lot of Ron Paul rallies. How many young people are following this 76-year-old man? So talk about the future of the Ron Paul revolution.
Sure. I've been following Ron Paul since 1988, and I wrote a book about him last year. And in all my years of talking to him, the most impressive thing about this year was, and he said this to me as well, is he cannot believe how successful these ideas are amongst the kids. 8,500 people at Berkeley, for goodness sake, one of the most left-leaning colleges in the world. And that is really the hope. You pinned it exactly. Ron is an interesting mix of apocalyptic, because he sees the dangers of government overreach and the fiscal crisis facing us, and hope, because he understands that we can return our government to constitutional principles that we can afford, that free markets do create wealth. And when he sees how many young people believe these ideas, he's hopeful, and so am I, because politicians are always going to be lagging indicators of popular opinion. Politicians are seeking votes. So we need a population out there who wants to vote for Ron Paul type ideas, and Ron Paul helped create that constituency. And I think each Ron Paul fan is out there being an apostle for Ron Paul. So even if Ron's not in office anymore, I think it's still going to grow.
Well, certainly one of the more interesting, dynamic characters that we here at RT America have focused on over the years. Certainly, probably a lot of our viewers are going to miss seeing our coverage of him, but you never know. There's always 2016. Brian Doherty, senior editor of Reason.com.